Welcome to the third and final episode of the mini-series here on Sfarim Chatter, Rav Kook, Life and Legacy. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode continues where we left off when Rav Kook arrives back in then Palestine as the Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem and his election as the Chief Rabbi of Israel. We discuss the infamous comments made at the founding ceremony of Hebrew University, the latter years of his life and his death, his impact and legacy from then until today, and as well as a lengthy discussion of suggested reading, whether primary sources or secondary sources, biographies, and things written about him. Rav Kook's yahrzeit is this Friday, September 6th, which is Gimel Elul, so this is airing on Thursday. It's tomorrow. That is why this series is airing this week, all 3 episodes. This mini-series is sponsored by Maggid Books, a division of Koren Jerusalem, who is the proud publisher of several works by Rav Kook, including a commentary on the Siddur compiled by Rabbi Betzal Naor and the newly translated Hadarav in his inner chamber, a collection of Rav Kook's most intimate writings found in his personal notebooks from throughout his career. They've also published Rav Kook's Orot in English, as well as a Hebrew English edition, as well as a new translation and commentary of Shabbat Haaretz, his work about Shemitah. Listeners of Sfarim Chatter can get 10% off all Koren and Maggid books with code Sfarim Chatter, SEFORIMCHATTER. Visit www.korenpub.com/Rav Kook. That's KORENPUB.com/RAVKOOK today, and you can find a link to that in the show's notes below. And you can also use the 10% off coupon on many Siddur, many other things they publish, Siddur, Machzorim, and other things. To sponsor an episode of the podcast, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or see the links in the show's notes below. You can also find a link to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new Sfarim, new books, book deals, and so on. Also, if you can please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever it is that you listen, whether that's on 24/6, Apple, Spotify, or otherwise. And finally, if you have any feedback, I'd like to hear it, whether via email, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or whether WhatsApp. If you're on the WhatsApp chat, you can WhatsApp me what you thought of this series about Rav Kook and what your thoughts are about a mini-series in general, whether you have other ideas you're looking forward to others in the future, what you liked or didn't like about a mini-series versus a longer series. And also, even if, do a mini-series in the future, did you like this concept of 3 in 1 week as opposed to, more compressed schedule? It's not necessarily something I'll always do, but here it worked out. But just putting that to you, the listener. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you enjoyed this mini-series. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast, another episode here on the mini-series about the life of Rav Kook. And once again, I'll be joined by Professor Yehudah Mirsky. This episode, the third, we're going to pick up where we were up to, which is the latter half of Rav Kook's life, his return to Eretz Yisrael after World War I, where he was stuck in Switzerland and England. Now he was in exile, the Rabbi of Yafo, but now he's returning as the Chief Rabbi of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem, and then there's going to be the Chief Rabbinate is going to be created, and he's going to become the first Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi. So, Professor Mirsky, thank you for joining me once again, and let's start over there.
Thank you so much for having me once again. Yes.
So let's start there. Let's start with Rav Kook's return to Eretz Yisrael and his in the post in Yerushalayim.
Right. So he comes back, as we said last time, by the close of World War I. The Zionists are firmly have the upper hand in the Jewish community of Eretz Yisrael, of Palestine. Their patrons. There are the British who eventually in 1920 received the mandate from the League of Nations over Palestine. The mandate means that it's there. And this wasn't the only place where colonial powers had mandates. There were mandates in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria. And it was sort of like that under the auspices of these of the imperial victors of World War I, these places would be gently guided to create republics of one fashion or other. Because also, in addition to our very Jewish story, this is also the time when the modern Middle East, as we know it, is taking shape. And in general, I think, especially in light of all the things that are going on today, one way of characterizing what makes something a distinctively Middle Eastern country, and not just in terms of its geography, but in terms of its sort of like social political type, is that these are places where all sorts of people have to live with other people that they didn't necessarily want to live with because they're all in borders that somebody else drew for them, in this case, the French and the British. So Rav Kook returns to Yerushalayim to be the Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem. As I said, the Zionists are firmly in charge, and in many respects, he has become. He was always like an interesting figure and a respected figure, but by now he's kind of an indispensable figure, right? So like he is the rabbi with the big shoulders and with the large philosophical perspective, who can, albeit in his own distinctive way, give broad support both to the Zionist movement without affirming its secularism all the way down, and support the rabbis who want to cooperate with Zionism without sort of telling them that they need to become full-out Zionists, etc. So he moves back to Yerushalayim. This is an extremely dynamic time, as to be the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Yerushalayim. There's a personal tragedy. His daughter, Esther Yael, who he was very, very fond of, dies in an accident, and that, of course, darkens the return back to Eretz Yisrael. And he also, but his position, so to speak, in as Rabbi of Yerushalayim, as such, is not very long lived, because in 1921 we have the creation of the Chief Rabbinate. Now, it's important to remember that the Chief Rabbinate was not a creation of the British or the Zionists as such, because under the Ottomans there had been such a thing, right? Generally, under the Ottomans, non-Muslim religious communities, which is to say Jews and Christians, were recognized under Islamic law as, valid, if inferior, religious groups, right? People of the book, Ahl al-Kitab, which means people who have a bona fide revealed scripture from God. And also in the late Ottoman period, we have this thing called the Chacham Bashi, sort of like the not just in Eretz Yisrael, but in all sorts of places. There is a chief rabbi appointed in consultation with the Ottoman authorities, and a crucial difference, by the way, between the Chacham Bashi in the Ottoman world, in the Ottoman sphere, and the crown rabbis, or as we're called, Rabbanim Mitam, in the Russian Empire, is that in the Russian Empire, these rabbis were often put there from the top down, and they were not necessarily Talmidei Chachamim, whereas by and large in the Ottoman Empire, the rabbis were Talmidei Chachamim, and who were sort of put forward by their communities and then, approved by the Ottomans. At any rate, we have, so there's a precedent for this, and yet the chief rabbinate is going to be something different. And in a sense, there's like three different sets of players at work in the creation of the chief rabbinate. The first is the British. The British, they've inherited this system from the Ottomans of different religious groups having their own leaders. And generally, not just under the Ottomans, but for all kinds of imperial powers, it was considered just like seichelic practice when you take over someplace to identify the local notables, put them in charge of the things that don't really matter, right? Like religion, like, family law, like inheritance, like all sorts of things like that, so that you don't have to worry about that. So the British are interested in having this institution. The Zionists are interested in having an institution like this, or at least many of them are, because this is a time of institution building. Right. And for Americans, the idea of having like religiously sponsored or state-sponsored religious institutions is very foreign, but this is very, very common, including Western democracies, including down to the present day. And so the Zionists want to build institutions. And of course, they like the idea of having institutions that they can control. And then you have Rav Kook, who is, on the one hand, the obvious choice to be the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. And yet he has a very different conception of who he is and what he's doing. I mean, he doesn't see himself as a handmaiden of the Zionist movement, right? We talked last time about Degel Yerushalayim and this movement that he tried to create, which never became much of a movement, but became a blueprint for a lot of things that he did, which was to create parallel institutions to the Zionist institutions, right? And so that alongside and a crucial innovation, halachic innovation, of the chief rabbinate was it was going to have a system of appeals courts, right? And there was another feature of the chief rabbin was going to be different. If you may recall, we talked last time about how in one of Rav Kook's first controversies, in the sesame oil controversy in 1906, when he's arguing with the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim about his heter for Mekitnius on Pesach, one of his arguments is, you paskin the way you want to in Yerushalayim, and I'm paskening the way I want to in Yafo. But now he's thinking differently and in a more structural and systematic way. And interestingly, not to get us too far off the track, but he's dusting off ideas that he had about 30 years earlier when he was first starting out. Some of his very earliest work was about and then some unpublished things that he wrote in the 1890s about the need to centralize halacha, and also because the idea is that he wants to create institutions that will be responsive to changing times and changing circumstances and move halacha towards a better future. By the way, we shouldn't forget his Sephardi counterpart, Rav Yaakov Meir. Rav Yaakov Meir was not, sort of like the great world historical figure that Rav Kook was, but in addition to being a big Talmud Chacham, he was also a very interesting modernist figure, and there's been all sorts of interesting scholarship on him in recent years. Now, there are some Zionists, very secular Zionists, who are alarmed at the thought of a chief rabbi, right? Because, of course, this is what they ran away from. They ran away from Europe in part to get away from this. And so there's assurances being made, that they will be accommodated. And, of course, Rav Kook, sort of in characteristic fashion, tries to convey that this is not an entity that will be wanting to coerce religion on anyone, but this is something that will sort of try to work as alongside part of the Jewish national revival. Now, part of his idea here, of course, in addition to in the early 1920s, so he's now the chief rabbi, and sort of like much of this work is about creating, we talked about how last time in Yafo, he's trying to supervise and encourage people to sort of the creation of an infrastructure of religious life in all sorts of new settlements and communities and agricultural communities, etc. So now he tries to do it in a bigger way. Over time, he's going to be hampered by the fact that he resolutely refuses to be political, in that he never joins a political party. He never formally aligns with any party in the Zionist movement, which as a result also means he has a very hard time getting budgets from people. The only political party he ever sort of expressed fondness for was Hapoel HaMizrahi, founded in the early 1920s. Remember, we talked about how in 1902, the Mizrahi Party, which is the religious faction within the World Zionist Organization, and the early 1920s, you have Hapoel HaMizrahi, which is these religious socialists, religious pioneers. Now, he also creates his yeshiva. And he creates a yeshiva that is going to be on the title Yeshiva Merkazit Olamit. And again, it's obviously central to his idea of institution building. And here, too, this is where he hopes to put forward a program of educating a new kind of rabbi. Right, a rabbi who will be able to be in dialogue with the times, who will know how to write good Hebrew, who will be philosophically minded as well as having halachic expertise. And to help him launch the yeshiva, he brings to Eretz Yisrael a disciple that he made during World War I, Rav David Cohen, known as the Nazir. Right, the Nazir was a fascinating figure. He was a Lithuanian yeshiva boy and very spiritually restless, and sort of finds himself exploring different places in yeshivot and in citizen in philosophy. At the outset of World War I, he's in Germany and he's interned in a camp for Russian citizens. He becomes close to a Chabad Chassid named Menachem Mendel Noy, who sort of converts him, so to speak, to the world of Kabbalah and Chassidut. Eventually, he goes to Switzerland and he studies in university. And at some point, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, Nachi, that Rav Kook is in Switzerland. So young David Cohen makes a pilgrimage to St. Gallen, where Rav Kook is learning, and the correspondence is very interesting. He's seeking a Rebbe, and he's seeking a master, and he's seeking an enlightenment. And at first, it seems Rav Kook isn't entirely sure what this very intense spiritual seeking young man wants from him. He has a very moving piece, the Nazir, where he writes about how, Rav Kook invited him to stay overnight. He stays overnight, and in the morning he overhears Rav Kook saying Birkos HaShachar. And the way in which Rav Kook says Birkos HaShachar just absolutely overwhelms him and becomes a phenomenal religious experience of its own. And he decides, this is my Rebbe for the rest of my life. And so he goes back to university. He's studying philosophy and aesthetics, and he's also studying Kabbalat Ha'ari, and they keep corresponding. And so as Rav Kook is starting the yeshiva, he brings David Cohen, who becomes a Nazir, lives as a Nazir, and he's always known as this Yerushalmi character, the Nazir, a Nazir to help him start this yeshiva. And he intends the yeshiva to be, remember, he's talking about parallel institutions, right? So if sort of like the Rabbanut will be the parallel institution to sort of like the court system that is coming to be, and some of the other institutions that are coming to be, the yeshiva will be the parallel to the didn't exist yet, but would come to be in 1925, the idea of the Hebrew University, right? Because I know, so remember, like the Zionist movement in general had two broad streams, right? Political Zionism and cultural Zionism. The political Zionism of Theodor Herzl that is seeking to find some sort of like create a Jewish republic or commonwealth or something like that in Eretz Yisrael, and cultural Zionism, for whom like Jewish nationalism and the Zionist project was a way of revitalizing Jewish culture, Jewish life, literature, intellectual life, and so forth, right, under the auspices of the leadership and vision of Achad Ha'am. And so for a long time, the idea of creating a Hebrew university, right, that was going to be like the jewel in the crown of cultural Zionism, right? I mean, you already have the creation of the Technion, right? Sort of this, and to this day, like very important scientific and technological institute. Parenthetically, in the early days of the Technion, there were these huge arguments. What should the language of instruction be? Should it be Hebrew, or should it be the leading scientific language of the day, which of course was German, right? There were huge arguments about that. And in the end, the arguments for Hebrew won out. In part for reasons of nationalism, in part also because American funders thought that if German was the language of instruction, the German funders would be running the institution, and they would be at a comparative disadvantage. At any rate, so he creates this yeshiva, and the idea is that this will be a really important institution of Torah learning to create a new kind of rabbi. Now, the cornerstone ceremony for the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus takes place in summer of 1925. Now, a few things come together here. Rav Kook is thrust into being a major public figure, right? Because now he has to deal with the British. He's dealing with the British government. Like when they make, every year, like the British embassy makes birthday parties for the king, and Avram Yitzchak Kook from Griva is like a guest of honor at the birthday parties for the king, right? It's this very surrealistic thing. By 1925, he has already engendered controversy, right? Now, when the Chief Rabbi is created in 1921, of course. What we call like Hayishuv Hayashan, the sort of a typical like Haida Haredit is essentially crystallized and catalyzed into existence as an independent sort of communal network sanctioned by the government by the creation of the Chief Rabbi, because Rav Kook, because Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld et al. Are in no way at all going to even create a havamina that they're going to put themselves under the authority of this man and his institutions. And so they want out of this, and the British are happy to accommodate them, right? And by the way, throughout the 1920s and late 1930s, there are all kinds of debates about how exactly the self-governing bodies of the Jewish communities in Palestine should be governed and organized and voted on and so forth. And by the way, interestingly, when the first elections for the National Assembly are held in 1920, the Mizrahi, there's a question: should women vote? And the Mizrahi asks Rav Kook, assuming that he will, of course, say yes, and he says no, right? Which is, it's something one could discuss at length. His opposition, certainly at the time, to women's suffrage. But there's all kinds. So at that point, there's all kinds of controversies swirling around. And then he becomes also especially controversial because, remember, like as we've said repeatedly, so much of Rav Kook's public stances derive from his theological views and from his hashkafa and so forth. And in 1920, we have the publication of a book, Orot, in which is edited by his son, Rav Yehudah, and is the first real book to come out that is like a product of, directly taken from his spiritual diaries, right? The texts that he's writing for himself. Before that, he'd published small books which were aimed, which were public facing, and letters of his had started to be published and so forth. But this, with Orot, so the reading public gets the full gusts, when the tempests arising out of his journals, and it's very heady stuff, and it's some of it is very controversial. Some of it is put in cherem, some copies are burned, and so forth. So he's already a figure of some controversy. Now, again, I'm talking a bit, and this is all leading up to his time at his speaking at the founding of the Hebrew University. Because I know it's a subject that greatly interests you. And also because a number of interesting pieces come together. He's also working, it's very important to him not to be a flag-waving Zionist and not to be anybody's lapdog, right? So for instance, if we take a look at certain Zionists, it's interesting to see, what are the large Zionist institutional projects he supports and what are the ones that he doesn't. And here I'm drawing on, as I'll draw on again in a few minutes, the work of the late Rav Eitam Henkin, who was the grandson of the great posek Osvelio Henkin, and Rav Eitam and his wife Nama were murdered by terrorists a few years ago. Eitam Henkin was a marvelous Talmud Chacham and scholar and wonderful person. So he, in a book with Rav Avram Wasserman, show how Rav Kook, if we take a look at the two large Zionist philanthropic efforts, leaving aside Hadassah for a moment, of the two large Zionist philanthropic efforts were Keren Kayemet, the Jewish National Fund, which was focused on land purchases, and Keren HaYesod, which was sort of a fund for general use for creating all sorts of Zionist institutions. Rav Kook was a profound supporter of Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael and did his best to support them and to raise money for them and always encouraged people to give to them. And, because also there were questions, like people said, should I give to Keren Kayemet or to Rabbi Meir Balanes? And he was said, you have to give to both, etc. He had very warm relations with Menachem Usishkin, the head of Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael, of the people in the official Zionist leadership, other than some of the socialists like Beryl Katznelson. He was one with whom Rav Kook had the closest relations, but he did not support Keren HaYesod. Why? Because Keren HaYesod was also creating creating secular cultural institutions and political institutions, and he wanted to keep that separate. He said, "I support Jews buying land in Eretz Yisrael. I'm not going to let that. I'm not going to raise, and I'm happy to raise money for that. I'm not going to raise money for Zionist, sports clubs and literary associations and others and other sorts of institutions. They should live and be well, and they should raise the money for that themselves." In 1924, he visits America for the first time. It's on a fundraising mission, but not for himself. Generally, he was not a good. Rav Kook was very bad at raising funds for himself, because in generally he didn't. He lived a life of extreme simplicity, and when he was great stories when he was rabbi in London. He had this practice, the housewives would come and bring him chickens to take a look, and if he decided that a chicken was treif, he would give the housewife money out of his own pocket so she could go buy another. And so after a while, like the shul in London had the rabbi's treif fund to pay for the But he was raising money for, remember we talked about how World War I was a fantastic calamity for the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe because they were directly in the line of battle, and there were Jewish institutions that were just destroyed in communities and yeshivot and so forth. And so he, along with Moshe Mordechai Epstein, went on a fundraising tour of America to raise money for East European Jewish communities. And we don't have much in the way of his impressions of America. But, I mean, America didn't seem to make a huge impression on him. But crucially for our purpose, I mean, for talking about the opening of the Hebrew University, one of the people in America whom he met and who left a deep impression on him was Rabbi Dr. Bernard Revel, the founder of Yeshiva College, which eventually became Yeshiva University. And they seem to find in each other kindred spirits, right? These two educational visionaries who have idea of creating, a different kind of yeshiva, and one that in each in the different circumstances relative to their own to their own places will try and sort of like create a new kind of traditional, or if you will, orthodox Jewish educational model. They had different ideas of collaborating. Eventually, those were undone by the Great Depression of 1921. But for instance, Dr. Revel sends Rav Kook a letter at one point saying, we understand that there's going to be a founding ceremony of this new Hebrew University. Do you think it's okay for a member of our faculty to attend this? Do you think this might be okay? And we don't have Rav Kook's direct answer, but we know that a member of the then Yeshiva College faculty, teacher of Talmud, did actually, named Zeitlin, did attend, right? So presumably Rav Kook said yes. So Rav Kook attends the cornerstone laying of the Hebrew University in 1925. This is a very big event. Lord Balfour himself comes. Winston Churchill, who's then the colonial secretary of the British Empire, comes. And Rav Kook gives a very long speech. He speaks for about 45 minutes, and it was a hot day, and a lot of people were very irritated with that. And interestingly, he gives this long talk, and it's very much about his ambivalences, right? He quotes, it's a long, the text that he talks from is that he talks about is the pasuk in Yeshayahu, right? V'ra'it v'nahardu v'chad v'rachav libech. Right? So like, what is it? How is it that at the time of like redemption, when like, our face is beaming, the heart is expanding and contracting in fear? What's that about? And so he walks through, he says, he argues, he says that the Jewish spirit has throughout history developed both through its own internal immanent resources and through external ideas and influences, right? And the heart of it is always the Torah, and the neshama is always the Torah and the specific Ruach Yisrael, with things that come from the outside, and things come from the outside. They can be helpful, they can be unhelpful. And essentially what he's describing is ambivalence about this shape and the direction that this new university will take. And the specific issue that bothered him was the possibility of teaching Bible criticism, Bikorat HaMikra. Now, already early on, there's a really interesting larger story here, and that's Rav Kook's attitude towards the academic study of Judaism in particular, in general. You remember, Rav Kook was like a disciple, and if you don't mind going on for a few minutes about this, but I suspect your listeners will find this of interest. So, and by the way, Rav Ari Shvat is a wonderful Talmid Chacham and scholar who's written a whole bunch of articles on this. And so remember, Rav Kook was very close to the Netziv, right? Now, the Netziv, in a number of ways, some scholars will argue, was, the legacy, the legacy of the Vilna Gaon had many parts, right? Part of it was Kabbalah, and of course, Rav Kook is very much of a piece. He's very much a Lithuanian Kabbalist in the tradition of the Vilna Gaon, especially as Vilna Gaon's ideas are interpreted through Rabbi Isaac Chaver. Even though he learns with the Leshem, and his ideas are close to Rabbi Isaac Chaver. The Netziv was not a great Kabbalist, but the portion of an element, a dimension of the Gra's teachings that the Netziv continued with, so to speak, the expansion of the rabbinic bookshelf beyond the Talmud Bavli, right? That you're also supposed to learn Yerushalmi and Tosefta and Midrashei Halacha. We also know that the Netziv had sort of like Yad Varegel in some of the traditional Maskilic writings of the time. Dr. Gil Pearl wrote this wonderful book about especially focusing on the Netziv's commentary to the Sifrei. But even if we take a look like the Netziv's massive, important work, Hamek She'ela, on the Shiltot Rav Chai, first off, the fact that he chooses to write about this Geonic work. And second, he has this long, important introduction to the Netziv called Kitmas HaEmek, where he sort of is working out his own idea of the history of Torah Shabbat Peh, which is, of course, like a major subject of discussion among scholars, and especially traditional Maskilic scholars in the 19th century. And then we see in Rav Kook, not just that he himself has tremendous Bekias in Yerushalmi and tells people to learn it and all of that, but from early on, Rav Kook is very supportive of young traditional Lamdanim and Talmidei Chachamim who want to incorporate elements of what today we think of as academic learning into their study. So his disciple Moshe Zeidel, to me, writes some very moving letters. If Zeidel is interested, Moshe Zeidel has a gift for learning Tanakh, and Rav Kook strongly encourages him to study Semitic languages, right, and to study grammar and philology and archaeology, and to put that to work in the study of Tanakh. And then years later, just see with the longer trajectory of these things, Moshe Zeidel becomes one of the editors of the Da'at Mikra series of Mosad Rav Kook, which on a Tanakh-wide level does exactly that, right? Sort of very traditional-minded Bible commentary, making good use of Semitic languages and archaeology and grammar and literary analysis and so forth. In the 1920s, Rav Kook has a daily chavruta with Shaul Lieberman. Young Shaul Lieberman, eventually becomes great professor at JTS, arguably the greatest Talmudic scholar of the 20th, academic Talmudist of the 20th century. Professor Lieberman's disciple, the late Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, once told me that every now and then he would quote, when he would learn with Professor Lieberman would sometimes quote things that he had heard from Rav Kook, and he would always preface it by saying, "I heard this from Hagaon HaTzadik, Rav Kook." And Rabbi Livni said to me, this Rav Kook must have really been something. He said that his exact words to me, he said that he could pierce a Kalta Litvak like Shaul Lieberman, that Shaul Lieberman called anybody Hagaon HaTzadik. So he's learned that. Also, Binyamin Menashe Levin, sort of the great scholar, was the editor, compiled Otzar HaGeonim, right? Had been a very close disciple of Rav Kook in his years in Eastern Europe. To be, in the interest of full disclosure, my grandfather, Shmuel Kalman Mirsky, spent many, many years doing all kinds of scholarly endeavors in the encouragement encouragement of Rav Kook. This idea of creating a kind of Judaic scholarship that draws on and takes the best of academic learning and is written in very good Hebrew and responsive to the needs of the time, et cetera, et cetera. So he's thinking about these things. But the really troublesome thing about the creation, and he has no trouble, he encouraged frum people to take positions, say Professor Abraham Frankel, who was an important mathematician, eventually becomes the rector. In English, we would say the provost of Hebrew University. He takes his job. He takes his job as an instructor of mathematics there at the urging of Rav Kook, because Rav Kook tells him it's very important for Jews who are Yerei Shamayim, who are capable of teaching university, to teach in university and have an influence on the nature of the institution. And Professor Frankel was, for many years, sort of the moral conscience of Hebrew in many ways. So he's encouraging of the enterprise in general, but he's very concerned about Bikorat HaMikra. He's very concerned about Bible criticism, and he's very leery of it, and that's very much what he's ambivalent about. He also knows that, again, the Eidah Haredit is really not going to be thrilled with his speaking at this event, right? Because of course, if the Zionists, because precisely the Eidah Haredit, understands the importance of a Hebrew university and why it's in a deep way so much more, to the extent to which if you view the Zionist enterprise as a threat, then Hebrew University is, of course, a lot more threatening than the Zionists building political institutions, whatever it is that they want to do. Right? So he gives this drasha, and it's shot through with ambivalence. But he says that he hopes that, the university will eventually see itself as kind of like an assistant to or a handmaiden to Torah scholarship, and the spirit of Yirat Shamayim will prevail and so forth. And so he ends up in this situation, and it's very important for him to read, during Chaim Weitzman is there, and Chaim Weitzman is passing him notes the whole time saying, could you please wrap up, Rabbi? This is really going on. And he said, no, because he needs to say his whole masechet about this. And everyone's upset with him. Obviously the Haredim, this doesn't impress them that he shows up and expresses great ambivalence. In addition to everybody being dragged through a long speech under the hot sun, a lot of the people in the university feel that they're very condescended to, very talked down to. And what's very interesting is at the exact same time, he writes a letter to someone in America who was asking him for how to think about the relationship between Jewish and non-Jewish culture. And he gives not a very different perspective, but a much less defensive perspective, where he talks about the different features, and it's very movingly about the different facets and features of human culture, that there's the natural sciences and technology, and there's the arts and aesthetics, and there's philosophy and this and that ultimately the spirit of holiness pervades all of them. Right? In terms of, as we've talked about, his theology of culture. But that's not what he says that hot day in the summer of 1925.
So we'll try to get to some of Rav Kook's thoughts and his svarim and things like that when we get towards the end of this episode. But one thing to discuss here, I think that's important, especially talking about him now that he's in Yerushalayim, he's the Chief Rabbi of Israel, is what is his opinion? What are his comments about the Beis Hamikdash, about the Kaisel, right, about the Harabayas? What is he saying about that? Do we know at this time?
First off, just on a somewhat humorous note, when he first returns to Yerushalayim in 1919, people are very moved that he's there and so on. And he's, one of the first people he goes to see on the day he gets back is Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Day after he gets back, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. And Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who always refers to Rav Kook as the Yafa, the rabbi from Yafo, right? Even through the 1920s, and sort of in the earth till the end of his life, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld is always going to call him the Yafa Rav, just to say he honors that this is the man from Yafo. And today it's like what we would say, he's the rabbi from Tel Aviv, with all that implies. So when they're having this conversation, and Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld says, I wish you that you will be zocher to be the Kohen Gadol in the Beis Hamikdash. Just a nice, courteous way. And it's also, I'd rather have you as the Kohen Gadol in the Beis Hamikdash and not as the Ab Beis Din of Yerushalayim. And Rav Kook says that's very kind. Needless to say, I'd be happy to be like a Kohen Hedyot, if I could. So his ideas about the Beis Hamikdash, in halachic terms, of course, he's against going up to Har Bayit, right? But it's really not much of an option. Anyway, but he's, that's at the basis. His ideas of the Beis Hamikdash are, and of course, early in his life, he's learning Hilchos Kodshim, and also he's going to be and early on when the Chavetz Chaim is working on Hilchos Kodshim and asks questions or asks the Aderet, about certain things, and the Aderet is consulting his son-in-law Avram Yitzchak Kook with, as they're learning together Dinei Kodshim and so forth. So on the one hand, of course, he very much wants to see the Beis Hamikdash, but he has, to my understanding, for him, Beis Hamikdash is one feature of Geula. And Rav Kook is very much a disciple of the Rambam. It seems counterintuitive because he's such a mystic. But in many respects, there's the Vilna Gaon is a huge figure for him, but in some respects, it often seems like the two sort of figures who are always accompanying him, or always, just hovering over his shoulder. One is the Ramchal, and the other is the Rambam. And why am I saying this? Because for Rav Kook, the Beis Hamikdash and the Beis Din HaGadol, as properly understood, are part of a package. right? And in many ways, you can't really have one without having the other, right? So so that the point of a Beis Hamikdash is to have Beis Din HaGadol. Point of Beis Din HaGadol is like the Beis Din HaGadol. Those are the Beis Hamikdash. And also for Rav Kook, theologically, the Beis Hamikdash, it's not just like a place where you do like really important things. The Beis Hamikdash is like the apotheosis, the coming together of it's like, Asar debeyachdun ruchin v'nafshin, right? That the Beis Hamikdash is where body and soul are united through korbanot and through avodah. And so here's elsewhere his vision of the Beis Hamikdash is one that is, on the one hand, it's like extremely far-reaching and aims for like that the Beis Hamikdash is like part of a transformation of all of human existence. Now, he is very committed to this ultimate transformation of human existence. For him, he doesn't say, this is a utopian vision I have of the Beis Hamikdash, so because it's utopian, I don't need to ever worry about it again. No. He actually wants to see it happen in some sense, but it's a very large and all-encompassing vision that can't be narrowed into like a specific political agenda. By the way, if we think about some other, it's interesting like how he thought about the idea of kingship, right? During World War I, he develops this idea that, that a king, he doesn't generally talk about kingship in his theological writings. Malchus Beis David for him is like the universal reign of justice, right? In some respects, there's also like elements of the Rambam in his teachings, and he also has a sense of like, at least in the present historical moment, that the Am can have the din of Melech, which is also his way of thinking about republicanism, or if you will, democracy. Now, however, he wants to have a vibrant Jewish presence at the Kotel. So the Kotel, right, and of course, in these years, nowadays we know the Kotel is this large plaza and this very public space and stuff. And then it was this narrow alleyway at the end of the Mughrabi quarter, the Mughrabi neighborhood of the Muslim quarter. Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld was officially there was no like Rav HaKotel like we have today, but Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld was the Rav of the Gabayim of the Kotel. And understandably, the status quo in which Jews were allowed to daven there and not much else, right? They were sometimes allowed to have benches there, sometimes not. They were never supposed to have a mechitza there. There were not to be attributes of like a permanent synagogue structure at the Kotel. That was a status quo that the Gabayim were happy to fulfill because it, under the Ottomans and then under the British, it meant that there weren't problems. And Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld liked the idea because, he was very committed to the idea that Jews should still see themselves as being very much in exile. And also he was concerned, understandably, that if anything that had the impertinences of a synagogue started to take shape at the Kotel, the Zionists would be running it. And so that was something that he very much, of course, wanted to avoid. On one Yom Kippur in 1928, the people brought in a mechitza, and then it was taken out, and at that point the Kotel began to become an issue, and you had like young Beitarniks, disciples of Jabotinsky, demonstrating on behalf of like there being a Jewish presence at the Kotel, etc. This gave ammunition to the Mufti of Jerusalem, right? Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was the titular leader of the Muslims of Jerusalem. When the British created the Chief Rabbinate, they also created something called the Supreme Muslim Council. And here too, the idea was that there would be some like religious body that they could supervise and through which they could run Muslim religious life. It didn't really work out that way. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, unlike Rav Kook, right? Well, Hajj Amin al-Husseini was very young. He was not a terribly well-respected cleric, but he was a Husseini, and Husseinis were a major, major family, one of the major Palestinian Arab clans running Jerusalem. Those of you, when you go to like one of the other major clans was Nashashibi. So those of you who are familiar with Jerusalem, the layout of Jerusalem, when you go to like Merkaz Ha'ir, where like Rehov Strauss and Rehov King George, and Rehov Yafo meet, there's a plaque there about the opening of the dedication of King George Street, and it lists Mr. Nashashibi as the mayor of Jerusalem. He was made mayor of Jerusalem, and in order to compensate the Husseini family, this young member of the Husseini family was named Mufti. Why am I telling you all this? Just like to give a sense, like, al Qtzei Mazleg, about like the thicker contexts in which these things are happening. In general, Rav Kook, like many early Zionists, was hopeful and perhaps a little naive about how the Arabs of Palestine would respond to the Jewish national project. It's worth remembering that Palestinian nationalism itself only really begins to start taking shape in the years right before World War I, and it's very much in response to Zionism. Rav Kook, during World War I, writes that, because the redemption of Israel will be a divinely guided process, of course it won't be violent, right? And also that because by the Jews having been in exile for so long, have learned how to do things without recourse to violence and so on. I mean, that's his general stance towards these things. The Mufti becomes the major figure in Palestinian nationalism, the Palestinian national struggle. He's a highly conflictual figure within Palestine, right? Because he refused to allow groups that weren't affiliated with him he made it very hard. I mean, for groups that weren't affiliated with him to operate. Also, there were arguments outside. I mean, it's just helpful to know that during the interwar years, there were a lot of Arab nationalists who were opposed to the Mufti because they thought this was supposed to be a pan-Arab struggle against all imperialisms, not just against the Jews of Palestine. And so he makes it a very Palestinian struggle, but the Mufti tries to make it a religious struggle of Jews against Muslims. And so he seizes on Har HaBayis as a site that he can use, especially because, and this the historian Hillel Cohen pointed out, the Zionists themselves weren't that interested in Har HaBayis, right? The Zionists had other institutions. They have Tel Aviv, right? They have their kibbutzim, and they have moshavim, and if they want like some spiritual center in Jerusalem, they have the Hebrew University. But the Palestinians didn't have sites for their national aspirations, and the Mufti decides to turn Har HaBayit into one of those. And so he sort of whips up this idea that this is when you start getting this idea that the Jews are trying to take over Har HaBayit, right? The fact that young nationalist Jews want to assert some sort of Jewish presence at the Kotel, then this becomes this thing that we then hear about till the present day, right? That the Jews want to take over Har HaBayit. And this becomes one of the things that then leads to the terrible, terrible riots of August 1929, right? There are terrible riots in August 1929, right? Praot Tarpat, the slaughter in Hebron and many other places in Eretz Yisrael, and then there's some Jewish self-defense and there's Jewish reprisals, and it's there's disagreement among the historians, like what is the point of no return in Jewish-Arab relations in Eretz Yisrael? Is it 1929 or later on the riots of 1936? So Rav Kook, as it turns out, when the riots erupt, aside from Yitzchak Ben-Zvi, there's a Zionist Congress going on elsewhere. So he is actually the senior, so to speak, Zionist official in the country, along with Yitzchak Ben-Zvi. And he does his best to get the British to intervene and stop this. He's not successful there, and he's very upset, needless to say, about that, and throws himself into relief efforts. I mean, this is where when Rav Kook first hears news on Shabbos of Jews being slaughtered in different places, he faints. And he's just overwhelmed with feeling. When he eventually comes to, he starts, even though it's Shabbos, he starts like writing telegrams saying, send help, because of course it's a case of pikuach nefesh. And for days he doesn't eat, hardly sleeps, just drinks some, the Nazir records that he drinks some tea and milk, and he throws himself into relief efforts, and generally, so he's beginning to see that this is going to be a conflictual situation, and he thinks that the British are going to be there for a long time. again, like this is like part of looking at things historically is to understand that people, we know, like living after events, we know how events turned out, but the people at the time didn't know how they were going to turn out, right? So he doesn't think that the British are going to leave anytime soon. They're going to put something in place that could make this thing work. And also with regards, frankly, when he gives testimony to these British commissions and so forth, he says things like, well, the Har HaBayit belongs to God. So like it's ultimately for God to sort this thing out, and unilateral human actions are not supposed to, so finally, to sort of cycle back to your question, he's like deeply committed to Beit HaMikdash. And deeply committed to its happening, al mechono, al madkunto, right? Every now and then he sort of gestures, like there's the Maimer Chazal and Midrash Tachum, it's like, Latid Lavo, the only carbon will be carbon, Okola carbonot, but Tehillim chutz min carbon todah, and carbon todah is the vegetarian carbon. So every now and then he writes about this. Maybe ultimately the carbonot will be like, who knows? But Tachlis, he very much wants to see the Beis HaMikdash and the Beit Din HaGadol. He thinks it can happen as part of an historical process, but it's going to take a while. Right. I think that's how one sees it. And in our chronology at this point, we're at the beginning of the 1930s,
which is really the last few years of his life. But something that really we've discussed throughout the series, but that'll take us a little bit back, is that really his relationship with the old Yishuv, as you'll quote,
yes.
you'll call them the Haredi, what would be known as today, but really the old. Yeah, I wouldn't call that exactly, but the old Yishuv, really, Rischaim Sonnenfeld, etc. And that's something that will take us back to 1921, to his meeting with the Imre Emes of Ger as well. And so there really are a number of things, and just in general, because I think that's very known to a lot of listeners, that Rav Kook, you've said a number of times throughout this episode in the series, Rav Kook wasn't really Zionist. He didn't have a place in the Zionist movement per se, but Rav Kook is perceived from those on the right to be, well, maybe not in the Zionist movement, somewhat in the political sense. He was a Tziyoni, let's use that word, right? And so that is a big part of the Rav Kook controversy, and the Rav Kook and those on the right, their opinion of Rav Kook. So yeah, if you can speak some more about all of that before we get to the last. Of course.
Well, what you're referring to, like the Imre Emes visits Eretz Yisrael, like there's a context to this, in that after, like I said, the Jews go through terrible economic hardship after World War I. And we're starting to see migrations, right? Migration continues to the United States until 1924. 1924 is when America imposes strict immigration quotas. I mean, my Brandeis colleague, Professor Jonathan Sarna, regularly points out that 1924 is one of the most consequential years, certainly in Jewish history, because that's when America closes its doors. And as conditions for Jews in Europe worsen, they really don't have anywhere to go outside of Eretz Yisrael. At any rate, but already at that stage, you are starting to have migrations, waves of aliyah to Eretz Yisrael of all kinds of people, including very traditional Jews, including traditional Jews from Poland, which we didn't have much more, right? We didn't have that, like in the earlier waves of aliyah, the Olim tended to come from Russia, and now they're coming. Now they're starting to come from Poland. Indeed, I mentioned earlier Poel Mizrahi, and there's sort of like two groups at the foundation of Poel Mizrahi. One are German religious German Zionists who see themselves as Latter Days disciples of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and Tarim Derech Eretz and so forth, and Polish and young people who grew up as Polish Hasidim, for whom like the ideas in Ger Hasidus of like Hanakuda Hapnimis and like finding your inner self are very important to them. Agudas Yisrael as an organization, in which the Imre Emes is prominent, right? Agudas Yisrael begins to see that it needs to start developing better relations with the Zionists. It's obviously not going to become a Zionist organization, but it wants to start checking out things. And again, like Polish Hasidim are starting to come in Aliyah, and it's in that context that the Imre Emes is in Eretz Yisrael, and he comes to and he meets with Rav Kook. And after they meet, when he's on the boat on the way back, the Imre Emes writes a letter, which becomes this very famous statement, sort of laying out like a for lack of a better word, like we would call like a Haredi perspective on Rav Kook, right? And he basically says that, listen, the man is a great Talmud Chacham, and he's a tzaddik and a deep neshama and all of that. But he's a great Oav Yisrael, and he lets his Avas Yisrael get the better of him. Right, sort of like that. He sort of sensed he saw Rav Kook as this person, like swept in this tidal wave of love and affection for the Jewish people, right? That sort of like overwhelms his better judgment as to exactly who he is dealing with. Interestingly, in the theological side of their conversation, Rav Kook doesn't. You would think Rav Kook would talk a lot about halat nitzotzot, right? The Hasidic doctrine of lifting the sparks from the material world, and he doesn't discuss it that much. I mean, because he's very, halat in some ways, this isn't our podcast conversation isn't about Hasidic theology, but like a lot of the Hasidic doctrines of halat nitzotzot, I mean, some of them, at their roots in like earlier books that well predate Hasidut, like the Shlaz and Chorabrit, and of course, certainly, the immediate. Somebody who's writing just as Chassidut is beginning to a little bit take shape, and that's the Ramchal, right? So that's where Rav Kook is getting those ideas from there. But in his conversation with the Ger Rebbe, he's talking about halat nitzotzot. He's using this Chassidic terminology. Also, there are these stories that in his conversation with the Ger Rebbe, with the Emri Emez, he was like also quoting passages of Sfas Emes by heart, etc. And so in terms of Hasidic theology, the Emri Emez says, he says that he's being malad and nitzotzos in these secular Zionists, but their nitzotzos aren't any, but there's nothing there to be maleh, right? There's nothing that he's misunderstanding the doctrine of halas nitzotzos, and it's like there's nothing there to be lifted up. But he sends this letter basically laying out a template for how to think about him, right? That, this is like a very great man who's sadly misguided. And this becomes a canonical statement. For many, and over time, the Kanaim of Yerushalayim, there are traditions of all kinds of things in the world, and there's also traditions of zealotry. And Yerushalayim has traditions of zealotry that go on for generations. And the Kanaim of Yerushalayim, of course, don't see things that way, right? But there's also something else. I think going on with the Haredi community. By the way, the great book on this, it's still a classic, was the book Chevra Vadat by the late Professor Menachem Friedman, where he unpacks all this in great detail. The Yeshuva Yashan is like being swept away, it seems, by the Zionists, right? Yeshuva Yashan was in trouble before. Yeshuva Yashan was very poor. Also, Yeshuva Yashan had not managed to establish great yeshivot of its own. So Yeshuva Yashan was always, gahak mitzaros. And they're being swept away by the Zionists, and they're kind of powerless to stop this. And Rav Kook is like, he's the closest enemy that they can get to. He looks like them, he talks like them, he lives like them, which is, of course, makes them very threatening, right? Because like they like, with like straight up, chilonim, like, David Ben Gurion or whoever, like the lines are very, very clear, right? So, and Rav Kook seems to be like blurring the lines between Kodesh and Chol, and between Kfira and Emuna, right? And also he's somebody to whom they have access. They can write letters to Ben Gurion and he won't, or to the other Zionist leaders, and they won't bother to read them. Rav Kook is close to hand, and he's somebody that they can. And also, what they're trying to do is also convey to other religious Jews, don't go near this guy. Suru Tamei al Tigo, so they can sort of like, supposed to speak, cauterize or create a perimeter. And then through the 1920s and then to the early 1930s, you start getting this complicated situation where at times the Agudas Yisrael leadership in Europe is trying to dial down some of the criticisms of Rav Kook, both because they have personal regard for him, like the Chavetz Chaim had great personal regard for him, but also because they need to have better relations with the Zionists than the Kanaim are letting them have. And so it's this very complex situation. Eventually, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, when he passes away, those are like the last restraints are left. To the extent to which Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld had sort of urged some kind of like even basic respect for Rav Kook as a Talmid Chacham and Yirei Shamayim, with his death, that goes. And the Furies are regularly unleashed. And then with 1933, we have the advent of Adolf Hitler. And understandably, the tensions are getting ratcheted up on all sides, right? And everybody is becoming scared and frightened and sort of like there's like the fierce internal ideological, by the way, and of course the ideological combats in Eretz Yisrael weren't just among like the religious and non-religious. Of course, they were within the Zionist movement, the socialist Zionists, the non-socialist Zionists like Jabotinsky, and even within the socialist Zionists, do you align with the Soviet Union? Are you a Marxist? Are you not a Marxist? This, that, right? So it's an ideologically extremely fraught. It's a terribly creative time, but it's an ideologically very fraught time. And when the Nazis come to power, then the temperature just goes way up.
So one more thing, if there's more to talk about this topic, about Rav Kook and the old Yeshuv, does Rav Kook ever respond, whether in orally or in print that we know of? Is he ever fight back or hit back at those that attack him?
Thank you for raising that. He doesn't fight back. He absorbs it. I mean, it's incredible. He, when you go through his archives, you see he's writing letters of recommendation on behalf of people who were attacking him. Right? There's an interesting volume called, we know of Igrot HaRe'aya, right? These volumes of Rav Kook's letters. And there's these letters, Igrot La Re'aya, which are letters to him by all sorts of Gedolei Yisrael. Now, many of them are about practical matters, because, can you help me raise money with a gemach? Or this is a letter of right? There's a letter of recommendation to, letter of recommendation to him on behalf of a Talmid Chacham, young Talmid Chacham who's coming to Eretz Yisrael, named, Avram Yeshaya Karelitz, who himself writes a couple of little shilas on mitzvos atluyos ba'aretz. After
Chazon Ish.
What?
The Chazon Ish.
The Chazon Ish, yes. Reb Chaim Ozer Gruzensky has genuine correspondences with Rav Kook, et cetera, et cetera. So Rav Kook never responds in kind. And that's like one of his most heroic achievements. He takes it hard. There's stories, his personal secretary would sometimes find him sitting and weeping, and like saying to himself in Yiddish, what did they want from me? What was willst from me? What do they want from me? There's a great story that one time one of his, one of Rav Kook's disciples found him walking in the street at night. And he used to walk around, and he used to go to the Kotel, do Tikkun Chatzos, and then just walk around and think. And so one of his disciples finds him and he says, Kvod Rav, right? Talmid Chacham al yelech yichidi balayla mipnei mazikin. And he says, I don't have to worry, because in this city the mazikin don't think I'm a Talmid Chacham. But he's always telling, and we have his time and again, always telling his disciples, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld is a great man. The people who follow him are great men. This is a machlokes l'shem shamayim. To be perfectly honest, on the other, you tend, well, just like that's his stance. And he had to endure terrible things. My grandmother had a cousin who, till his dying day, right, the thing that he was proudest of in his life was he had once thrown a bucket of sewage water into Rav Kook's face. This is great. So, one of Rav Kook's disciples is Rav Aryeh Levin, right? And Rav Aryeh Levin, there's a great story when he's walking, the great Yerushalmi Tzaddik, Rav Aryeh Levin, right, who was very close to Rav Kook. It was Rav Aryeh Levin became the chaplain, so to speak, of the jail in Yerushalayim at the suggestion of Rav Kook. When the British wanted somebody, he suggested. So Rav Aryeh Levin, one time he was walking in the street and he slipped and he fell in a puddle or something like that, and some guy started yelling at him, Ken Yovdu, Bavod Rishayim Rina, Ken Yovdu Rishayim, etc. So Rav Aryeh Levin gets up and he goes over the guy and he asks Mechila, and he says, why do you ask Mechila? And he says, well, I must have done something to offend you. The guy upset Nivhal, and he goes away. So then somebody else is watching this and comes over to him and says, Rabbi, you have to understand, everybody loves you. It's nothing personal against you. It's that Rav that you hang out with. Like you're truly Mekayim, and I love him, Veinam Olvim, Shamim Karpasim, Veinam Ashivim. But it's fine, but like that Rav, he's the problem. Rabbi said, who do you think taught me how to act like this? Right? You have all these stories like, Rabbi Zalman Meltzer. There's one time here's some guys knocking Rav Kook, of course. And he says, I don't agree with the man. I really disagree with him very deeply. Halavai, I should daven Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur the way he davens Mincha on a Tuesday. Right? You have a lot of stories like this. But also, so this is the very conflictual atmosphere. This is the very feverish. By the way, and again, just generally in terms of Rav Kook's own life, it's a lesson. I mean, it's something that we all could stand to learn nowadays, to try and not answer in kind when people like assault us and criticize us, whoever we may be. And again, in Rav Kook's case, part of it was his midos and working on himself. I mean, there's a story, he was friendly with Rav Hutner. When Rav Hutner was a young man learning Eretz Yisrael, he would learn in Hebron, and he would then visit Yerushalayim, and he would spend time talking with Rav Kook. And when he would return, so to turn to Hebron, so the Slabad Gazeta would interrogate him about Rav Kook, how he acted, how he did. Tell me, how does he say Kiddush? How does he do Until Yadayim? What does he say about this? What does he say about that? And when Rav Hutner asked him, why are you so interested? He said, you have to understand, he's nicht von unser. He's not one of us. He's not he's not a Musser. Aber is Tzursa Musser. Right, that he's the very form of what a Musar personality should look like, but it's also because they had hashkafa of really taking very seriously machlokot l'shem shamayim and arguing that people this famous, I think we mentioned, right, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. Well, how? Because he says precisely through the Ritcha D'Oraisa and the arguing and so on and so forth is how you get a truth. But it's in this very conflictual atmosphere that we get to the last great controversy of his life, and it was one that went beyond the religious, non-religious issues, and that's the murder of Chaim Arlozorov. Right, Chaim Arlozorov was a boy wonder. He was this remarkably talented young intellectual who, at a very early age, had become the political secretary, that, so to speak, the shadow foreign minister of the Jewish agency. And so when Hitler comes to power, what do you do? And one very practical question is, do you try to negotiate with Hitler to let him let Jews out of Germany or not? And again, this is 1933. Nobody really has a sense, some people have a sense of what Hitler is and others don't. The Zionists, the mainstream and the labor Zionists, of whom Chaim Arlozorov was a leader, a young leader, argued that you try to negotiate with Hitler as best you can. The Jabotinskyites were very opposed to this because they thought it was a deep affront to Jewish honor and pride, and this is part of the general disagreement that the Jabotinskyites had with labor Zionism. Jabotinskyites were capitalists. They were anti-Marxist, they were anti-socialist, and also they had a conception. I mean, the story of Jabotinskite Zionism is a really complicated thing because it went through all sorts of processes, etc. You had disciples of Jabotinsky himself was not a fascist, in my opinion, but you had disciples of Jabotinsky in the 1930s called themselves fascists. Abba Achimeir, right? Had a regular newspaper column called Mi Yomano Shel Fascist, right? It's from the Diary of a Fascist. Lo Ayu Chasirim, things for the revisionists and the labor Zionists to argue about, but this question of do you negotiate with Hitler became a flashpoint. And you have revisionists attacking Ben Gurion when he's traveling in Europe, and you have all kinds of, and you have this aforementioned Abba Achimeir, who I'm going to talk about more in a second, is important young revisionist, fiery, passionate revisionist writer, intellectual, journalist, etc. Arguing that people like the communist Arlezerov is a traitor, and the Jewish people always knew what to do as traitors, etc. One day in June 1933, Chaim Arlezerov is walking on the beach with Tel Aviv with his wife Sima, and somebody steps out of the shadows and shoots him. Okay. Who killed Arlezerov? Right? So, l'chara, the answer is obvious. It must have been the revisionists, right? Like during the Watergate trials of the 1970s, Congressman Hamilton Fish, they were always looking, where's the smoking gun that we can use to catch Richard Nixon? And, what's the line on tape when Nixon says, okay, go and, do these illegal things. And at one point, the Congressman Hamilton Fish said, we don't need a smoking gun. There is no smoking gun. We don't need one because the room is full of smoke. Right. And so that's how people thought about the revisionists. Isn't it obvious that they must have killed Arlezerov? They're calling for his blood all the time. They're saying these blood curdling things about him. So, the day or two after Abba Achimeir writes about him, somebody shoots him. What more do I need to prove to you? Right. And yet, Rav Kook keeps his own counsel. He doesn't take sides on this for a while. Because he's genuinely not, he really doesn't want to make accusations about, right? From early on, people want him to defend the revisionists. And so people want him to, attack the revisionists. And of course, he's not going to do that. I mean, because he wants to take his time. But people say you have to come out and defend them. And he takes his time. Over time, he and others become convinced that the revisionists did not kill Arlezerov, but that Arlezerov was killed by a couple of Arabs. And he's not the only one who comes around to that, including there were people who, early on, were sure that the revisionists did it, and eventually they become convinced that they're not. One of the people, interestingly, who, it's also because Rav Kook has ties in the police, and he's people tell him what's going on in the police investigations and so forth, and he becomes genuinely convinced that the revisionists are not guilty. And then one of this, just in terms of also we forget what a small community this was. One figure who plays an important role in changing and swaying Rav Kook and bringing him to the pro-revisionist position is a rabbi named Rav Natan Milikovsky, whose son Ben Sion is a young journalist associated with revisionists, and he says that he himself was in Yerushalayim with, the revisionists accused of this crime. And Natan Milikovsky's son Ben Sion eventually changes his last name to Netanyahu. So basically, Binyamin Netanyahu's grandfather is one of the people who convinces Rav Kook to take the side of the revisionists here. So the revisionists are acquitted, but some of them are still in jail. And when Abba Achimeir in turn goes with the aforementioned Abba Achimeir, whom Rav Kook had never met and didn't know and had likely never read a thing that the man wrote in his life. But he goes on a hunger strike, and Rav Kook writes him a letter urging him not to go on a hunger strike, and he refers to him as Sofer Yakar, dear writer. At that point, the tensions are so high that the labor Zionists become convinced that Rav Kook is a rabid supporter of Jabotinsky and the revisionists. Right. And yet Rav Kook by now, for him, there's these Jews that are unjustly imprisoned. He wants them to get out of jail, and he also wants them not to starve themselves to death. And so he throws the full weight of his authority by now into holding rallies and sending telegrams and writing letters, and trying to get them acquitted, and also trying to convince them to end their hunger strike, which eventually happens. The chief, the guy who was the chief suspect from the revisionists, this fellow Avraham Stavsky, eventually he dies on the Altalena, the ship the Irgun ship bringing arms to Eretz Yisrael in 1948 that's fired upon under Ben Gurion's orders by the battery commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Yitzhak Rabin. I mean, the interconnections here are just amazing. Once the dust settles, Rav Kook tries to mend fences with the labor Zionists, and it doesn't work. Beryl Katznelson, who was alongside with Beryl, he's less known to people because he died in 1945, but Beryl Katznelson was was alongside Ben Gurion, the great leader of labor Zionism in those years, and also like Ben Gurion, a very serious intellectual. And unlike Ben Gurion, Ral Katznelson had very warm feelings towards religion and always wanted labor Zionism to have a deeper relationship with Judaism, Jewish tradition than it did. He tried to mend the fences between Ben Gurion and Rav Kook after the Elazarov affair, and Rav Kook was interested, but Ben Gurion wasn't. And then Rav Kook dies on Gimel Elul, Tafresh Tzaddik. Right, dies in 1935.
So, one thing that we haven't mentioned, and this has come up as well, is that what Rav Kook's attitude was toward the Arabs.
Well, yeah. So, as I said, he, interestingly, after, from very early on, when disciples of his, or even before World War I, Mayor Berlin, the son of the Netziv, who eventually becomes Mayor Bar Ilan, right? It's after him that Bar Ilan University is named. He's an important leader of the Mizrahi, Mayor Bar Ilan. Mayor Bar Ilan, in some article, makes derogatory references to Arabs, and Rav Kook tells him to cut it out right away. Right? Just he's not going to have that. In halachic terms, when we talked about Heter Mechira, we said that he, as I pointed out, that part of his signing on to Heter Mechira was holding that the Isur of Lo Sechanim doesn't apply to Muslims, because it's like fairly, I think it's not an outrageous halachic opinion, to my mind, like by any means, that like Muslims are not considered idolaters for one purpose or other. Where these issues really get joined, of course, is after the riots of 1929. And at that time, the Mufti tries to he writes these open letters to Rav Kook, and the Mufti's trying to goad Rav Kook into speaking in terms of religious war and religious struggle and jihad, the same way the Mufti is talking about this struggle, and Rav Kook refuses to go along with that. Some might say he's being terribly naive, but he refuses to, keep saying we're going to do this all b'darchei shalom, and this may take time, but the Arabs of Palestine are people of goodwill, and we have no ill intentions towards them, etc., etc. Right? That's and because he also, it's just as an historical when Rav Kook's large, expansive ideas are being really worked out, it's still in these age of empires when we forget that through the 19th century and parts of the 20th century, nationalism is a liberal idea, because the idea is you shouldn't be ruled by some foreign empire. You should govern yourself, right? It's over the course of the 20th century that nationalism becomes much more this thing of national groups fighting against one another. As we said, he passes away in 1935, by the way, at his deathbed. He's surrounded by some of the figures we've mentioned. He's, at his deathbed is Rabbi Aryeh Levin and Rabbi Zalman Meltzer and Yechiel Michal Tukachinsky, of course, Yankov Moshe Harlap. When something like 15,000 people come to his funeral the next day. So he dies before seeing the Holocaust. He dies before the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. Right? And of course, he dies before the establishment of the State of Israel. And so there's the question of his legacy. Now, the chief rabbinate as an institution doesn't really take off in his lifetime. In part, as I said, he had many gifts. Of being an administrator wasn't one of them. And also his being very apolitical and his unwillingness to affiliate with a party. And also because, it wasn't just not capable, like some people are more talented in administration than others. He hadn't thought much. He had ideas about statehood and he had ideas about state institutions, but unlike, say, Rav Herzog, who succeeded him as Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Rav Herzog was somebody, by the time Rav Herzog comes to be chief rabbi, he spent decades thinking about how do you integrate Jewish law into modern legal institutions, right? And as I say, my Brandeis colleague Alex Kay has written a really interesting book on that. And also the Sephardi chief rabbi succeeds Rabbi Yaakov Meir, Rav Ben Sion Uziel, who would, been, so to speak, who had been like Rav Kook's Sephardic rabbinic partner, junior partner in Yafo, is also somebody who has like a much more has like a much more systemic way of thinking about creating system. And also by now, by the 1930s, 40s, etc., you start, the HaChavra LaMishpat HaIbri is founded in 1926. You by now have had like, a decade or two of people writing about these things. The yeshiva, now, Rav Kook's writings come out slowly over time. We mentioned the Nazir, right? So like in terms of his machshava writings, in 1925 or so, Rav Kook publishes Orot HaTshuva. Orot HaTshuva is, Rav Kook starts writing a treatise on tshuva. He writes 3 chapters of it, and he doesn't really go further. He's not great at like this sort of extended systematic writing. So his son Rav Yehudah takes passages from his notebooks and creates this treatise Orot HaTshuva. And Orot HaTshuva it's worth talking about not only because Elul is near, but Rav Kook's conception of tshuva is theologically very important for understanding his relationship to Zionism. Because also let's think about like what tshuva is in Kabbalah. In Kabbalah, tshuva is associated with the sphira of Bina, right? In terms of the sphirot that like the divine emanations at the very, very highest level, Keter Chochma Bina, right? And so in Kabbalah, right, for many, many, many centuries, Bina is tshuva. And so tshuva is sort of like a return, and Bina is Eim HaSfirot. So Bina is sort of like is the womb of creation. And there's a deep sense in which like tshuva is rebirth. And another name for Sfirat Bina, of course, is Cherut, freedom, and Yovel, right? Because in the Jubilee year, so to speak, everything is reborn, right? Everything goes free, and everything is like, because also there's this concept here of freedom, right? We know Rav Kook talks a lot about freedom in his writings. And freedom for him, in philosophy, there's a distinction that's made between like 2 types of freedom, negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom means like the absence of restraint. And positive freedom is like positive freedom is the ability to realize oneself and flourish to the fullest. And when he talks about freedom, that's what he means, right? Because for Rav Kook, the soul naturally drives towards God. And so the free soul, a truly free soul, will reach God. Because Torah liberates you from your human limitations and enables you to return towards God. And Rav Kook, so as a Kabbalist, he sees tshuva happening as a cosmic process, right? The entire cosmos, the entire world is trying to do tshuva and return to God. And the Jewish people are trying to return to God. And each individual is trying to return to God, right? There's this image of these very concentric circles. So those are the sorts of ideas that appear in Orot HaTshuva. But his works, but the other work that really that's put together after his death, I mentioned earlier of WWII, the Nazir. Starting in the 1920s, the Nazir is of the people in Rav Kook's most immediate circle. He was the only one who had university education. And it had like some sort of systematic grounding in philosophy and comparative religion and so on. And the Nazir asks Rav Kook, do you have a system of some kind? Do you have a whole thought-out hashkafa? And Rav Kook says, I think I do, maybe here. And the Nazir says, and he gave me shmona kavatzim, 8 notebooks. And Rav Kook gives him 8 notebooks that are written between the years 1910 and 1919. That is sort of our premier sources of his thinking and sort of, so to speak, the heroic years of his theology. And the Nazir starts writing something, putting together a text called Orot HaKodesh. And in Orot HaKodesh, it's an attempt to present Rav Kook's ideas, which are sort of like all over the place, as like some sort of systematic philosophy of religion, which is for Jews, but also like takes account of like the religious life of humanity. And the Nazir, Rav Kook isn't much involved in it. Rav Kook approves of, like, volume 1 is pretty much finished at the time of Rav Kook's death, and Rav Kook gets to see like the page proofs of volume 1. Of course, Rav Kook insists that he be referred to on the page as nothing other than like Harav Avram Yitzchak Kook, no honorifics, no whatever. Interestingly, in terms of like Rav Kook's legacy in the late 1930s, early 40s, much of the interest shown in him is by academics. I mentioned the Hebrew University, right? And Rav Kook was in contact, especially with the people who were doing philosophy and machshava, et cetera, at Hebrew U. In particular, Rav Kook had very warm relations with Shmuel Hugo Bergman, who's a wonderful figure. He was he was a disciple of Martin Buber, and was a very important philosopher and teacher, professor of philosophy, et cetera, at Hebrew University for a very long time, and was the first, like one of the, today, in Yerushalayim, we have this magnificent new building, the Sifriya Leumit. So the National Library was a project that started in the late 19th century. In the 1920s, merges with the Hebrew University, right? It's like for a long time, until just earlier this year, right? Like the National Library of Israel is part of the Hebrew University, and Shmuel Hugo Bergman is the first librarian. And so he's regularly getting books for Rav Kook. There's farm that Rav Kook needs. And, as the librarian of Hebrew U, he's able to get them for him, and they're having conversations. And Hugo Bergman and other intellectuals, in some respects, precisely because of their philosophical training, a little bit like the Nazir, like they have the kelim to understand aspects of Rav Kook that his immediate Talmidim aren't. Because in his actual yeshiva, Merkaz, so I said, in Rav Kook's short-lived yeshiva in Yafo is where he came closer to realizing the broad educational vision of also like educating people in philosophy and all of that. That happens much less in Merkaz. And so you start having Bergman and his colleagues like Natan Rotenstreich writing about Rav Kook. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, he and Rav Kook know one another. Scholem thought that Rav Kook was a great, maybe for reasons of his own, he calls him the last, but he says he's the last great Jewish mystic. But he's a little leery of his messianism, of course. Rav Kook himself said about Scholem that he was deeply impressed by his bekias in Kabbalah and his intelligence, but was very disturbed by his regarding Kabbalah as not a truly sacred subject. But a really important disciple. So, for the immediate successor of Rav Kook as the head of the yeshivas, Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Charlap, is a big Talmud Chacham. And Charlap dies in the 1950s, and he's succeeded by Rav Kook's son, Rav Yehudah Kook. But a really important, part of what Rav Kook accomplishes in his life through Merkaz is that he creates there's these eyewitness accounts, right? Of people start noticing walking around Yerushalayim a different kind of yeshiva bachur. That there are these bachurei yeshiva who seem to be very pious and seem to be very learned. And they're also Zionist. They speak Hebrew to one another and not Yiddish. They seem to be conversant with the world around them. They seem to be very interested in helping the Zionist movement while retaining a very distinctive religious identity. And one of them is Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria, who becomes a crucial figure in Bnei Akiva, right? And Bnei Akiva is a religious youth movement, right? Because also Zionism, all these nationalist movements, has these youth movements, right? And each party has its own youth movement. And so through Hapoel HaMizrahi and through Bnei Akiva, you start getting a generation or two of young religious Zionists who are taught in a yeshiva context that they are part of the Zionist movement, not lesser partners of the Zionist movement, but that there's a spiritual meaning to the Zionist movement. Right? The political leaders of the Mizrahi, right? The Mizrahi is founded by Rav Reines and eventually his successor, Rav Maimon, Yehudah Fishman, Cohen Fishman Maimon, who's one of the signatories of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. If you take a look at the famous photos of the Israel's Declaration of Independence in 1948, Rav Maimon is sitting right next to Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion, Jerusalem was under siege, and Ben Gurion sent a plane to bring Rav Maimon from Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv. So it was very important to him that Rav Maimon be there. And Rav Maimon is sitting, and sort of like the way, maybe exaggeratedly, but the way I look at that photo is it's very important for Ben Gurion to have Rav Maimon sitting next to him, both to sort of signal his support, and also the Rav Maimon is sitting right next to him where he can keep an eye on him. And, in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, God is never mentioned. Right? There's an oblique reference to God in it says as Tzur Yisrael, right? However, Rav Maimon, when he signs the Israeli the Declaration of Independence, he sort of adds a little squiggle, and if you look closely, the squiggle is Bezrat Hashem. So it's sort of like Rav Maimon, and it's very revealing. It's very indicative, right? Sort of like the official Zionist project is going forward as a secular project. The Mizrachnikim, so to speak, are along for the ride. And, the Bezrat Hashem is like a little squiggle that they're attaching to it, right? Like there's the status quo that's developed, etc. But the point is that for a long time, religious Zionism is totally fine with being being like the faithful junior partner of the labor Mapai governments that create the state of Israel, right? So like labor, so the Mizrahi, they sort of like, they have Misrat Hadatot, and they have the chief rabbinate. During after 1948 and before 1967, like we have this massive building in Yerushalayim, Meichal Shlomo, which is the seat of the chief rabbinate, and the idea is it's still an echo of Rav Kook's idea that like the traditional Judaism as part of the Zionist movement should have parallel institutions. So it's like located not that far from the Knesset, and especially because the first Knesset building was just a few blocks down, on Rehov King George. And Rav Kook also he's studied by philosophers. His works are studied in Merkaz. He's not like part of the central curriculum of the yeshiva. And of course, after his death, the yeshiva is from Yeshiva Merkazit Olamid, is renamed Yeshiva Merkaz Harav in his memory. His works are studied in smaller circles, taught smaller circles by Yehudah and the Nazir. Now, I mentioned that Rav Kook crucially dies in 1933. And so his son, Reb Yehudah, right, eventually becomes the Rosh Yeshiva. And of course, being the son of a figure like that is, immense shoes to fill. And Reb Yehudah is made to face challenges that his father, with all his greatness, never had to deal with. His father never had to deal with the Holocaust, and his father never had to deal with the actual existing state of Israel as it emerged in 1948. And Reb Yehudah at the Declaration of the State of Israel, let's put it like this: on the 19th Independence Day of the State of Israel is 1967. And that is when the country is preparing for war. Everybody knows that a war is coming, and they're anticipating a terrible blow, right? There's a great sense of apocalypse in the air, kind of like it's not unlike the sort of the waiting season that one has in Israel today, is wondering what the Iranians have in store for us. Rav Yehudah tells a story there about how he responded to the UN partition vote in 1947. It's a very famous sikha, and he says that he was actually very ambivalent about the UN partition vote in 1947. Everybody's dancing in the streets, and I can't dance. Why? Because ve'ed artzi chileku, right? So, like, what Eretz Yisrael is like is right, because his father taught. That Eretz Yisrael is not some secular thing. Eretz Yisrael is not a platform for like building political and financial institutions. Like, Eretz Yisrael is a spiritual entity in the world. Eretz Yisrael is homologous with the Shekhinah, with Torah Shabbat Peh, with Knesset Yisrael. And so how can you divide it in half like this? Right? Right? And yet, he comes to the conclusion, and Rabbi Yankov Moshe Karlab came to the same conclusion, and yet, this state is the embodiment of God's redemptive plan. This state, with its prosaic institutions, with its post office and its transportation ministry and all of this stuff. And then a few weeks later, we had the miraculous victory of the 1967 war, and Eretz Yisrael is liberated. Now, and yet it's still so. And there's another. So, how did Rav Yehudah think about the Holocaust? So again, Rav Kook was like a philosopher of history, right, and saw God's hand working through great historical events. And we talked about how during World War I, Rav Kook is of course appalled by the slaughter, and he hopes that a better world will arise from this, right? That this is some sort of Melchemet Gog uMagog. In the end, you see, actually, you have the Balfour Declaration, right, which seems to confirm that messianic reading of this apocalyptic war. And Rav Yehudah says a similar thing, but in a darker vein. There's a phrase that Rav Kook uses in his book Shabbat Haaretz, right, which we talk about Rav Kook's treatise on Shemitah. In the introduction, Rav Kook refers to Korban Bayis Rishon as Nituach Achzari, right? That there was a cruel surgery that Rabbeinu Shalom had to do in order to create this the second stage of Jewish history, the exilic stage of Jewish history. That would be as sort of the antithesis to the biblical stage of Jewish history before the ultimate synthesis of redemption. Rav Yehudah takes that phrase and uses it as a key to understand the Shoah, right? That the Shoah was the Nituach Achzari that Ribbono Shel Olam had to do to the Jewish people to get them to Eretz Yisrael, which means that Eretz Yisrael is even more important than we think. Rav Yehudah is not he's not a believer in Shlilat HaGolah in sort of the cliched Zionist way of, I don't like Eastern European Jewish culture, right? Rav Yehudah lives in Geula his whole life. He speaks Yiddish his whole life, right? But he has this sense that this is the greater drama of world and Jewish history that's being enacted here, which means that this really is Geula. And as a result, planting the flag of Israeli sovereignty on the biblical heartlands, on hilltops, in the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, is itself part of the Geula. Now, this idea doesn't really take off until after 1973. Because if you take a look, in a wonderful book on this is by Gershom Gorenberg called The Accidental Empire, about the first decade of Israeli settlements. And by the way, I'm talking about settlements because I know it's something that people are very interested in. It's almost criminal to take Rav Kook's legacy and narrow it or just make it this one thing. We'll talk about that in a little bit, in a few minutes. But if you take a look, the early settlements between 1967 and 1970 and the War of 1973 are created first by secular Zionists, labor Zionists, because they're just acting out of instinct, right? Like they did under the British Mandate. You settle, right? It's a natural impulse. And not only that, already in the years before 1967, as happens whenever a revolution is successful, people wonder, how are we going to keep up our ardor? How are we going to keep up the fervor? How are we going to keep up the ideals? And already before 1967, there's Israeli intellectuals and public figures who are wondering, are we becoming too materialistic? Are we losing our revolutionary fervor? Are we going to get lost in the flesh pots of Tel Aviv? Shalach Shov that Tel Aviv was such a place back then, but still. But most of the settlements in those early years are founded by labor Zionists. Big exception, of course, is Gush Etzion, which had been a collection of religious kibbutzim when one secular kibbutz before the war, and people who had been children in Gush Etzion before it was captured and many of its inhabitants massacred, returned. And also we have Moshe Levinger, student of Rav Yehudah, settling in Hebron. But what really, and this is I'm going on about it because it's a point that's underappreciated. When the settlements really take over is a response to really take off and take flight is a response to the 1973 war. Because then, like today, you have the sense that there's this political leadership that has utterly failed. Right? The labor Zionist leadership, created by Ben Gurion, and then in his successors, Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, have utterly failed. Right? And that the failure is obviously political and diplomatic, but it's also moral and cultural that it got to this, right? Now, by now, you have a generation or two of students of Rav Neria, people who grew up in Bnei Akiva, people who grew up in Yeshivot Tzinoor Datit, people whose rebbes had been students of Rav Kook in the 1930s, who have taught them that the true meaning of the Zionist movement, which the Zionist movement itself doesn't understand, is that it's about the spiritual redemption of the Jewish people and thus of the human race. and that it's precisely through the connection to Torah that Zionism like realizes itself and goes beyond itself. And so while the mainstream Zionist leadership is just reeling from shock, and what do we do as far as they're concerned? We know a way forward. We know you have lost your way because you've forgotten that, like, you thought that establishing a state was enough, and you didn't realize that you had to march towards Geulah. And again, in Geulah, not just for the Jews, but for everybody, right? And that by building Medinat Yisrael in an ideal society here in Eretz Yisrael, we bring Geulah for the whole world. This is also, there's echoes here of the youth rebellions of the late 1960s, right? And in deep ways, when they're, the youth rebellions that sweep like Western, North Europe, West European and North American universities, et cetera, in the 1960s, they take a lot of forms. But in Eretz Yisrael, the way they really take form is with the founding of Gush Emunim. And if you take a look at the founding documents of Gush Emunim in 1974, they say, beferish, the national leadership has failed. And so we have to pick up the flag here because we understand the true meaning of this, right? And we have to assume national leadership. And also, they are tired of always being, remember, like I said, I painted that picture of Rav Maimon sitting politely next to Ben Gurion during the reading of the Declaration of Independence, right? And he's mafdal, in the 1950s, the two religious Zionist parties, the Mizrahi and Hapoel Mizrahi, merged and create mafdal, Miflaga Datit Leumit, which at this point, late 1960s, early 1970s, is always content to be the junior partner of the Labor government, and also they're politically very moderate. On the eve of the 1967 war, there's the question, do you open a front against Jordan, do you not? And the Mafdal is against it. Isn't that how you capture Jerusalem, the old city, and it's how you capture Yehudah Shamron? Yeah, but you don't go making war with people, right? These are it can be overstated, but they're politically very, it's fundamentally moderate. So you have now Tzirei HaMizrach and you have Gush Emunim, and they sort of take over the Mafdal. And then, we're sort of like the real, sort of like the 1973 is a seismic shock in Israeli politics, and really comes home to roost in 1977 with the election of Menachem Begin, right? Hamahapach, the great overturning. And Begin, he's a traditional. He's not, you wouldn't call him Orthodox, but he's deeply traditional, deep respect for religion, and sort of and again, in ways that Jabotinsky wasn't. Right, Jabotinsky grew up in Odessa. Right, Jabotinsky had grown up in the cradle of Jewish secularism. Menachem Begin's from Brisk. He's this Polish Jew. He's very traditional. He's the first Israeli prime minister. As soon as he's elected, the first stop he goes to the Kotel. Right, and also he wins through creating a coalition of people who had been marginalized under labor Zionism, including Mizrahi Jews. And because he's a traditional person, he can speak to them, right? Because he has struck with like traditional religions. This man who knows how to put on tefillin and puts on tefillin regularly, right? And also these younger generations of religious Zionists, as well as his own revisionists. And he's foursquare committed to the project of settlement, and then for security reasons and for reasons of national pride and identity. And also because Begin grasps that this, others grasp that the settlements are a way to like handle some of Israel's housing problems, right? How do you get affordable, decent housing and an easy commute from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv? And so Rav Kook's teachings like start being like tremendously revived. But also they come to be understood as synonymous with how he's interpreted by his son. Right? And that's a crucial feature. Now, not everybody, so then like, another within the world of religious Zionism, so like a person who had like, the very important figure, but like who didn't quite have like not quite the reach and sweep of Rav Yehudah is my, Mori Rabbi Rav Yehudah Amital, right, who was the first Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion. This yeshiva founded in Gush Etzion. Rav Amital was a Hungarian Jew from Grossradine who had discovered Rav Kook's writings before the war as a yeshiva boy in Hungary. When he was Moshe Tzvi Neria, who I mentioned earlier, Rav Neria had a small book called Mishnat Harav, which is like a small anthology of writings of Rav Kook. And Rav Amital, then he wasn't Rav Amital, he wasn't Amital yet, he was Yehudah Klein. When he was taken to a Nazi labor camp, he smuggled his copy of Rav Neria's Mishnat Harav in with him. After the war, he comes to Eretz Yisrael, and he marries a granddaughter of Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, and he sort of emerges as this prominent Talmud Chacham in the world of religious Zionism, with deep ties to the Haredi world. He fights a soldier in 1948, et cetera, and he becomes it's a long story short, but he becomes the first Rosh Yeshiva, this yeshiva in Har Etzion, Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush Etzion, and he sees himself very much as a disciple of Rav Kook. And he sees this as a redemptive process. And yet, crucial for him is, Rav Kook's corpus is vast and sprawling. And Rav Kook doesn't write systematically, right? So like his chief theological writing are these journals, which, in the last 25 years or so, these journals have been getting published in their original form. And we see like they're all over the place. They're astonishing works. Because Rav Kook, he'll take a paragraph and he'll write something. And at first you think it's just like this beautiful flight of poetry. But then when you read it closely, you see like he's using... It is beautiful. On one level, it's beautiful poetry, and he's using technical Kabbalistic terminology and sometimes philosophical terminology in his poetic writing. And in this poetic flight, he's like working out issues in how you understand this or that aspect of Kabbalat Ha'ari, or this or that aspect of like how you understand this passage or that passage from Moreh Nevuchim, right? So it's a large, sprawling corpus, and the question is like, what is the chief teaching? And frankly, for Yehudah, for lack of a better word, for Yehudah, the chief teachings are Eretz Yisrael and Geulah. And for Rav Amital, like the chief teachings, like sort of the key interpretive thread of Rav Kook's teachings on Musar and ethics, which he also relates to Zionism, right? Because Rav Kook writes, why did God feel the need to create a separate people, the Jewish people? In order to be Mekadesh Shem Shamayim in the world, in order to right, Ki Yadati V'Leman Asher Yitzaveh, right, B'nei Yisrael B'nei Acharav, L'asot Tzedakah Mishpat, etc. Right? And so the point to Eretz Yisrael, and Rav Kook was a Holocaust survivor, and yet as an interpreter of Rav Kook, he said the point to Eretz Yisrael isn't to ensure Jewish physical survival. Of Medinat Yisrael is not to ensure Jewish physical survival; it's to be Mekadesh Shem Shamayim through the institutions of a modern state and through a modern society and all that sort of thing. And then over time, as Rav Yehudah and his disciples become more and more convinced of their messianic reading of the times, and the settlement of Eretz Yisrael, and this becomes real machlokas. Like is settlement of Eretz Yisrael the most important thing, right? Or is that the central thing? Because also you asked earlier about Rav Kook's attitude towards Arabs, and generally Rav Kook's attitude towards non-Jews. You read Rav Kook, on one hand, he will say things that are the most universalistic sounding things that you'll see of any Jewish thinker about, how the Spirit of God is pulsing through like the best of art and poetry and philosophy of all the world cultures, and like every religion is its own facet of divinity, et cetera, et cetera. Other times, he'll say things that, are like shockingly, nowadays we call them essentializing, about like that the Jewish people are inherently different from everybody else and Jews are very distinct from everyone else, and so on and so forth. We have Piskei Din, where when people ask, well, can we use, what we need, medical schools say they need cadavers for autopsies. And he says, well, maybe you could use non-Jewish cadavers. So he's up, and other times he says straightforwardly that, of course, the Meiri is right, that like don't count as of the Avodah Zarah. And there's different sorts. He has nice correspondence with the Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem, Rav Eitam Henkin. It was a Rav Ari Schwat, who I mentioned earlier, found this correspondence. Like the Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem is sending Rav Kook these like nice greetings for Rosh Hashanah, and like Rav Kook like writes him very nice letters back, etc. So, as an interpreter of Rav Kook, then. If you see yourself as somebody who's interpreting Rav, as somebody who's somehow a disciple of him, or a latter-day successor of his, like, how do you understand him, right? How do you understand him, and how do you read him? Why should you care, right? Okay, so he's a gadol. He says things. All sorts of gadolim say all kinds of things, right? Why? So part of what it is that, and you see like the interest in here moving closer to the present. Why do so many secular figures are interested in Rav Kook? And philosophers and historians? So there's different things going on. But also like, what are the stakes of interpreting Rav Kook? So there's different ways of putting this. One is that, he provides, the modern world is so perplexing. The modern world is so perplexing. And how is a frum Jew supposed to respond? And one response, of course, is, well, just like don't change, right? But that too is a modern response. When the Chassam Sofer says Chodesh Asher min Torah, so Chassam Sofer, it's not my place to like give points to historical figures like this. Chassam Sofer is being extremely insightful about a key feature of modern times. When Chassam Sofer, you'd imagine like a maskil saying Chodesh Asher min Torah, what? There were never innovations in halacha? What? Like show me, like there's no such thing as a drabanan, there's no such thing as a takana, there's no such thing as a gzera, there's no such thing as right. When Chassam Sofer says Chodesh Asher min Torah, he's like putting his finger on a key feature of modern life, that the new is celebrated as being new for its own sake. The fact that it's new is a good thing. It's a different so that's like a defensive, and so that engenders the fundamentally defensive posture of Chodesh Asher min Torah, which is, creates a different set of halachic instincts, so to speak. If like one set of halachic instincts, like a question of first impression comes up, like a new sort of a novel kind of question. So once upon a time, I might have said Nesi Sefer B'nechzeh, right? And let's figure this out. Now it's like, no. Like my assumption is that this is bad. My presumption is this is bad. But then what happens, right? Because Rav Kook reveres the Chassam Sofer. Like, remember I mentioned that like in his polemic in 1906 about the sesame oil controversy, he says beferish to the rabbis of Jerusalem, listen, the Chassam Sofer was right in his time, but the people we're dealing with here are not the people that he was dealing with. Like, so what do you do with like a Jewish national movement that's led by principal idealists who are sacrificing themselves for the welfare of the Jewish people? And also because like a lot of, but I mean, Rav Kook is not, I don't mean to paint him as a straightforward disciple of Chassam Sofer, because he's not, right? Because also like the challenges of modernity are real, right? And the questions it poses are real, and the intellectual challenges are real, right? So how do you work with that? And also like, how do you work with like these like massive historical changes, the falls of the fall of empire, the rise of the nation state, the evolution of international law? So he seemed to provide a roadmap, right? And so then the stakes of arguing over Rav Kook, one way of looking at the stakes of arguing over Rav Kook are he provides the key to modernity, but who has the real, who knows how to read him? He provided the code book, but how do you read the code book to understand what the deeper currents of modernity are, if you want to look at history in those ways? There's another reason why people are very drawn to Rav Kook. I mean, there's a lot of things we could say, but this has to do, in a sense, with what we call political theology. By political theology, we don't mean just like the, religion and politics and how religious institutions deal with politics, but political theology is a term of art in the world of political thought, which refers to the ways in which modern political ideas seem to be reworkings of theological ideas, right? To take like an example, it's not exactly linyanenu, but just to give an idea, right? The idea of human rights seems to be, working like it's a kind of that the idea that there's like an inherent dignity to the human person. This is sort of like a reworking in terms of, in modern terms, of an idea of tzelem Elokim. And if that sounds a little far-fetched, take a look at the people who first used the term human rights, and they tend to be very religious, not necessarily very religious Jews, but very religious Christians, right? The idea that history is moving someplace, is going someplace, right? That history will have a happy end. Is that a secularized version of the messianism of the Hebrew Bible? And so the ways in which Rav Kook is offering like a theological reading of Zionist politics and history become very important, right? And those becomes the stakes of it, so to speak. Because also like, and also like as a friendly critic of Zionism, Rav Kook is telling Zionism, if you don't have a deep relationship with Jewish religion, history, tradition, you will go astray. You will morally and spiritually go astray. You won't even know yourself and know how to sustain yourself. So to put it a little differently, Rav Kook, the deepest or tectonic questions of, is Zionism a rebellion against Jewish history, or is it a continuation of Jewish history? He provides language and a framework for talking about that. And then there's another one. I mean, there's so much we could say, but there's another feature of Rav Kook's thought that's really important. Is there Rav Kook, on the one hand, he thinks he has an awful lot to say about the collective, but he also has an awful lot to say about the individual. And I'm indebted to this formulation for a wonderful scholar of Rav Kook and religious Zionism and much else, Dr. Shlomo Fisher. He put it that like the modern language of personal experience and subjectivity, Rav Kook finds a way to talk about this from the deepest resources of Jewish thought, right? When he talks about atzmiut and the notion of finding yourself and every individual finding their place in the individual tikkun and so forth, right? So he provides this language and a conceptual framework for dealing with like large questions of machshava, of theology, of nationalism and of politics, but also a very personal and subjective. If you take a look, like so much of the, like when I was young, the 1970s and 80s, et cetera, so much of the interest in studying Rav Kook is around the ideas of Geulah and how do you apply them politically, et cetera. In the last decade or so, tremendous influence in Rav Kook's writings as like an expression of personal religious experience. People taking his works and like setting them to music as poetry, and sort of he's an inspiration for like the religious Zionist community's embrace of like the arts and theater and movie making and music making and all. So there's an awful lot going on here, even though his teachings are like go in that direction, as well as also we haven't talked about the Chardalim, the Haredi Leumi branch of his Latter-day Disciples, whose primary representative in the Israeli government today is the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich.
Yeah, and I think really, and I've let you run long there because I think you're saying a lot of things. No worries. They're saying a lot of things that are very interesting, and we can go on and on and on about Rav Kook. There's so much, and his thought and his writings, and there's countless works being published. A couple of things to mention here, and obviously we can continue going on for a long time, but just to wrap up this series, and of course,
to have a little Rahmanis on the listeners.
Yes, if they're still listening, we can talk more. So first of all, Mossad Rav Kook has the bulk of his writings, and some have been, some have been reprinted, some have been retypeset. They're all available. A few years ago, they put in one volume, Orot HaTorah, Orot HaTshuva, Orot HaRaya, Musar Avich, and Reish Milah. Now is one volume with a new print. They have, Ohaz Halacha works that we discussed in the previous episode. There's other works from him. Now, his letters, which are interesting for those that want to read his letters. So the first three volumes, the core letters are, the first three volumes are Mossad Rav Kook. Then there have been a number of other ones in the blue volumes that have been through Machon Rav Yehudah B'Siyua Beit Harav.
And there are two, and as the notebooks have been coming out, there's two different sets of publication.
So before I get to know, I just want to finish. So the letters, there's Igrat Haraya, so there's those, and then there's even one volume that was published by Machon Har Bracha, and then recently they just published two new volumes, the Machon Beit. So there's a whole bunch of other ones. Yes, and the Shemona Klatzim, as you've mentioned, there's different editions. If you want to just mention those.
Also, wonderful works of Rav Kook is his parish on Ein Yaakov. Right, his parish on Ein Aya,
right? Is that Ein Aya?
Which is his parish to the Agaritas of Masechet Brachos and Shabbos, and there's also a little bit of the like Yerushalmi Peah. And he writes most of it in Eastern Europe, though he goes on working on it for the rest of his life. And he sort of at the very, very end. At the very, very end, he gets like halfway through Masechas Shabbos, and I'm trying to sort of look up here, like towards one of the very, very last places one of the very last things he writes, and so like it's one of his last entries in Ein Ayaz. He writes about the virtues of simplicity. Because also part of what makes Rav Kook's writings so striking is that he, when he writes in the Kvatzim, in his notebooks, these like expansive theological passages, he always ends them with like a very simple pasuk or a very simple line from the Siddur. And it's very deliberate because also he's like following in the Moreshet Hagra, right? Because so much of like the heritage of the Vilna Gaon was like Lachzir Kol Davar L'Sharsho. Right, it's like the Gra, because also Rav Kook spends a lot of time writing what he called Be'er Eliyahu, which is like his perush on the Gra's perush, Be'er Gra Shulchan Aruch. And so, like, with the way the Gra will, like, take this like machlokas and machlokas Rishonim, and he shows it's really machlokas in the Gemara, and then he shows it's really two sides of a mission, then he shows it's like and then he shows it's like two sides of a pasuk. So Rav Kook is very in that vein, very, very in that vein as well. So like this, so Ein Ayaz is a wonderful thing to read. Now, yes. His notebooks have been published in two separate editions. One is called Kvatzim, and one is called the Pinkasim. And, there's the manuscripts, they're kind of a mess. I mean, they're all over the place. A lot of them are in private hands and so on. And also, and sort of these two different Hotzaot, a lot of them, they have the same copies they have copies of the same materials, but some will have others, some will have not. By and large, the ones called Pinkasim, Pinkasei Hare'ayah, are published by the circles that are still very close to Yeshuat Merkaz Harav and so forth. And those are, some would say the word censorship. They are edited with a very heavy hand. And, what's the difference between like editorial work and censorship? It's like when when Rabbi Yehudah publishes a Roda Tshuva or Musar Avicha, he tells you beferish, I'm like, I'm editing these things from my father's notebooks. But also when we have notebooks and you see things are left out and you're not being told that they're left out, right? And then there are Pinkasim there that there are notebooks of Rav Kook that have not been published, and reportedly Rav Tzvi, who's like the spiritual leader of the Charidim Lumim, has told disciples that he has notebooks of Rav Kook that he would rather burn than let them be published because they would give aid and comfort to people who are, are deliberately misinterpreting Rav Kook all the time. And in the interest of full disclosure, I don't know if I personally am in Rav Tau's screen, but I know he's talking about people like, among others, he's talking about people like me. So the fights over the manuscripts and the publication are there's stakes, again, to use this word again, there's stakes to them beyond, just like scholarly accuracy and so forth.
Right, and so a lot of these are Musar Rav Kook. Musar Rav Kook also has Shmona Kvatzim that they published a few years ago, and so there's also Metziut Katan.
Right, Metziut Katan is an early notebook. Also, I want to mention a wonderful Talmid Chacham who died just the last year or so, Zichrono Livracha, Rav Moshe Tzuriel. Moshe Tzuriel was American-born and wrote many, many Sfarim, not only Rav Kook, but he has this 7-volume work called Otzrot HaRe'ayah, where he both found all sorts of writings from Rav Kook that never appeared elsewhere, and he also has wonderful indices and so forth. And also Rav Tzuriel did very important editions of works by the Meiri, Chibur HaTshuva Meiri and works of the Ramak and many other. And so his Otzrot HaRe'ayah is wonderful. For biographical information on Rav Kook, Rav Moshe Tzvi, who I mentioned, wrote a whole series of volumes, gathering biographical information on Rav Kook, as well as all sorts of other information. And his books really are a gold mine. A fellow named Yeshayahu Be'eri did a wonderful set of volumes called Ohev Yisrael B'Kedusha, where he gathers all kinds of materials in Rav Kook, and what he does at great length, more than Rav Neria does, the Rav Neria's works are indispensable, is that he also documents a lot of Rav Kook's relations with like the intellectuals and the writers and the poets and so forth of the second Aliyah. And then there's some other works like that I'm happy to let people know about if they're interested.
Yeah, and in English, there's obviously your two books, your sweeping biography, Rav Kook,
there's
Time of
other.
Revolution. Here's your other English book. Well, I want to mention it. There's your other book, your second book, which focused on the beginning of his life. There's those two. There's Betzalel Naor has done a lot of work, a lot of translations.
Betzalel Naor is a huge Talmud Chacham and has done wonderful translations and with richly annotated of a number of Rav Kook's works as well as other works. And he also is deeply holding in the history, the Kabbalistic background, philosophical background. The late Rabbi Ben Sion Boxer did 2 volumes of translations of Rav Kook's writings, one published by Paulist Press, believe it or not, in their series, The Classics of Western Spirituality. Another published, I forget who was the original publisher, but recently republished a few years ago by Ben Yehudah Press. Rabbi Yehudah Sinclair did a wonderful edition of a translation of Rav Kook's introduction to Shabbat Haaretz, and his own introduction to that introduction. Rabbi Sinclair's is a wonderful introduction to Rav Kook. There is a new translation of Musar Avicha that was self-published and is on Amazon. And I'm just briefly looking up the name of the Rav who did it, because he did a wonderful job.
I'll let you look it up. And just for these a number of ones, especially the ones available here. So just to say for the listener, like a lot of the Musar of Kook, they should be. I don't think
Rabbi Josh. Excuse me, that's Rabbi Josh Gerstein. Did a wonderful edition of Musar Avicha.
So a lot of the Musar of Kook ones and a lot of Hebrew stuff are not available in America, but they're accessible. They're available in Eretz Yisrael. But those I won't link, but I will link what's available here. Again, I know there are listeners all over the world, but for the listeners, most of the listeners available in the United States. So I will link to Professor Mirsky's books. I'll link to Betzalel Naor's, the other ones, Sinclair, the English Musar Avicha. A lot of them, by the way.
Also, what I should mention, Koren has put out. There's Chadarav. Right?
That's So I'll mention. So Betzalel Naor, some of them are self-published. I know the Rabbi Bar Chana one and some others are with Kodesh Press, and then he also is involved with some of the Koren ones. And Koren has a number of volumes. So I'll try to put together a list of all the English ones that are readily available, the translations and adaptations, etc. of those. I do want to mention one book in Hebrew from Hebrew University from Magnus, which is Narya Gutol's Chadashim Gam Yeshenim, which is a book about the halach.
Which Narya Gutel?
It's Chadashim,
It's a great book.
That's about the halacha. For those interested in the halacha and the halachic works.
Yeah. Also, what's really interesting in that book of Neri Gutel, Rabbi Professor Neri Gutel, he's also a big Talmud Chacham. He sort of investigates, what, to the extent to which Rav Kook has a distinctive attitude towards psak, and in terms of incorporating, larger considerations in psika, how does he go about doing it? And also part of what makes that book so valuable is that he also has extended comparisons between Rav Kook and other poskim like Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Shalom Zalman Auerbach, and so forth. It's a wonderful, wonderful work of scholarship.
What I don't know, I don't know if you know, are there any books or readings that are the anti-Rav Kook side that come from or is just any old Yeshua publication?
I mean, it's like this. I mean, in terms of criticisms of Rav Kook, there are any number of, there's different, in terms of internal Jewish religious criticisms of Rav Kook's teachings, there's different versions you could do, right? So for instance, to take the most extreme, I remember reading, for instance, obviously Satmar teachings, right? Vayol Moshe and so forth, right? Moshiach Shel Yisrael, which is this multi-volume biography of Rabbi Eilish, has a whole chapter devoted to Rav Kook. And I mean, at times, when I remember reading it, it was a funny experience reading it. On the one hand, I couldn't help but appreciate the wit of arguing that Rav Kook was mibayis and michutz bakofer. I thought that was very clever. On the other hand, when you read where he's viewed in this official biography of Rabbi Eilish, where he's viewed as mamish satanic, and that all of his Limud Torah was just a ruse to trick people. That obviously Yeshayahu Leibovich, right, the very important philosopher. Yeshayahu Leibovich is one of these people, one of these figures who had great personal respect for Rav Kook and disagreed with him entirely in his interpretation of Zion. And Leibovich was a Zionist and deeply religious, but not a religious Zionist, right? Even though Leibovich read Rav Kook, I did one time, believe it or not, go through Leibovich's. I found that I was able to see Leibovich's personal library before it was like distributed to his like grandchildren. And I saw like right by his desk, he had like, his key books, like you had like Rambam and Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and so forth, and his copy of Orota Kodesh. And I went through and marked down all the passages that Leibovich had like marked on Orota Kodesh. I've yet to, and those were either ones that moved him or ones with which he disagreed very deeply. Yitzchak Breuer doesn't write. There's like one place where Yitzchak Breuer writes about Rav Kook, and it's very insightful, sympathetic but critical. But generally, I think Yitzchak Breuer's writings are like I think they're insufficient. I think they deserve greater study. And as like a very intelligent critique of ideas of religious Zionism, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think that like the Haredi community in Israel made a great mistake in sort of following the line of like Rabbi Eilish and denouncing Zionism as just like, Ochlin Avelis and stuff, rather than like going with the much more profound philosophical criticisms that you get from Isaac Breuer. Obviously there's, by the way, a really good book that lays out these issues, and it was an academic book, came out about close to 30 years ago, but still very excellent, by Professor Avi Ravitsky. In the Hebrew edition was called Haketz HaMeguleh Medinat HaYehudim, and the English is called Zionism, Messianism, Jewish Religious Radicalism, and he beautifully does justice to theological anti-Zionism of the Minchas Elazar. He has great discussion of the Minchas Elazar, and he discusses Rav Kook, of course, very intelligently, and Lubavitcher Rebbe and others. And Chabad. So that's a wonderful book. And there's all kinds of like what you have a genre in Israeli writing in recent decades of people knocking Rav Kook and Rav Kook's ideas, but they tend to be, from like a secular point of view, but they tend to be people who don't really understand what he's saying, right? And so, and I'm sure there's people you could talk to who would have a better grasp of the contemporary, like, contemporary Haredi thinkers like Rav Morgenstern or Rav Kluger. I'd be very curious to hear, who I assume knows a thing or two about Rav Kook. I'd be very curious to hear what they think about it. Because also what's the best thing, what's always really interesting on those occasions, and like Yitzchak Breuer is a great example, when you read somebody who is critical of Rav Kook but has the kalim to understands what it is that he's trying to do, and on that basis is critical of it.
And I will say here at the end that Rav Kook is not an easy read. I think that's important. Rav Kook's own works, if you're reading his own works, not the history books about him, his own works, and maybe that's come through in some of the things that you've said about his thought and his ideology. It's not easy. His writings are not easy. His thoughts, his ideas aren't easy to read, and just, worth pointing that out, I think, for listeners.
And also, it's the same way. It's like, and also he's not, first just like in terms of genre, like the years in which he's writing, the 1890s, 1900 to 1920, 1930, like Hebrew literature itself is discovering itself as a contemporary, like we've mentioned Ahad Ha'am. One of Ahad Ha'am's achievements is like writing essays in Hebrew, like in modern Hebrew, which people, so Rav Kook, he's trying to write a new kind of literature, and he's trying to think very new and different ideas. And often, like when people get discouraged reading him, why is he so hard to read? And I tell them, like he's not writing for me or you, but he's like writing for himself. Though again, some of the works we've talked about, like his letters obviously are meant to be read by other people. His his Agadata commentary, Einayah, he wrote it as something that was meant to be studied by people. And so they're regularly easier to understand, even though they require a bit of work as well.
Okay, so I know that we went long.
I'm terribly sorry
on this episode.
But
and listen, there's 3 episodes. We could have gone many more episodes. I still can perhaps have episodes with others about Rav Kook, and I'm sure for listeners, hopefully this was an interesting to learn more about Rav Kook. And for those, I'm sure there are those that will be upset to hear more about him, or won't like hearing this, or wanted to hear one thing, they wanted to hear more positive, more negative, etc. But I think this is just to sum it up here. This is something that you argue in your book, and you've said throughout the podcast, that Rav Kook was kind of at least you're the way that you are portraying him and framing him as someone that didn't make a lot of people happy. People on both sides were not happy with him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there were people. It's funny. There were people who loved him on both sides also. I mean, Lo Stam, 15,000 people came to his funeral, right? When he died, there was a Zionist Congress taking place in Europe, and the Congress just adjourned for the day so that everybody could mourn Rav Kook, right? So he's, I mean, okay, could I end with a story?
Yes, absolutely.
So a story that has to do, did I tell you this story about October 7th, in the wake of October 7th? So my wife, Tamar Yella, has a, by the way, it's also important especially for American listeners to read just how much Rav Kook is studied here. When I was first dating my wife, I told her I was this American guy. She's very Israeli. She grew up in Bnei Akiva and Beersheba and Machshav and the whole, and she told that in America nobody reads Rav Kook. She was like, "Az al ma'im medabrim bichlal, al mi yesh lem ledaber." A dear friend of ours is young Israeli woman who is was a Reform rabbi and was the rabbi of these secular kibbutzim around the Gaza area that were attacked on October 7th. And one of the very first funerals she did afterwards was a very secular family. And they said that they wanted whose parents were being buried together because Lo Aleinu, they were burned together. And they said that they wanted to sing a song as their parents' grave. Their parents were being lowered into the grave, and our, friend didn't, this isn't usually her thing, but she wasn't about to argue with them. As their parents, these very, very secular kibbutznikim, as their parents' bodies are being lowered into the grave, they start singing a song taken from the words of Rav Kook. Ben Adam alei lemala alei lemala alei. And when we heard this, my wife said, 100 years ago, Rav Kook loved them. So many of the other Rabbanim were telling these secular socialist pioneers that they were terrible and they were awful and they were traitors to the Jewish people, et cetera, and Rav Kook loved them. And she said, Lakach mea shana v'lahava chozeret be'olam. So he defied and defies easy categorization. Right? You can't call him a Zionist and you can't call him an anti-Zionist. Right? He's a Lithuanian Makubal and he's a lot of, he's a Litvak and he's a Lithuanian Makubal and he's also a Chabad thinker. Right? He defies categorization in the way that the spiritual giants genuinely do. And that's part of how they challenge us.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Mirsky, for joining me for these 3 episodes, and I hope the listeners enjoy it. And any feedback, they can let me know. They can reach out to you. I'm sure if you want, you'll hear from listeners, and they can read your books to read more. And I will put a link to your books and a number of these other books that we talked about, suggested reading, that anybody's interested in reading more. And again, I'm sure there's a lot more about Rav Kook that we could say and we haven't said, and that we'll get comments and so on. But at least,
yes.
I will just end off personally that, we've, the two of us, Professor Mirsky and I, we've known each other kind of somewhat via Twitter for many years. This is going back many years ago when I started Farm Cheddar Twitter. And even when I started the podcast, I don't know, somehow you're one of the first academics, so to speak, that I know, but I never got around to doing this podcast. And so finally you followed up. You followed up with me recently, a few months ago, about this, and I said, we really should do it, and I haven't done really anything on Rav Kook. And the idea really was that, even though you did a great job in your 1-volume short biography in the Yale series on Rav Kook, it's really hard to do, what I was thinking, an hour and a half, what are we going to do, 2 hours? This episode was over 2 hours. We're going to do 1 hour and a half on Rav Kook. It's not going to work. It wouldn't work. So to split it into 3-part miniseries, there's still more to speak about. And I get for other figures as well, they could be. But anyway, I thought this would make sense, at least to get a lot of the basics and some more about Rav Kook's life. So thank you for joining me, and I hope the listeners found it enlightening and interesting.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all your very patient listeners.